About a year ago, I talked about how to thrift some nice sweaters, unravel them, and turn them into usable luxury yarn with a little bit of a sweater unwinder that I created. And I thought that this time, because I have access to a lovely 3D printer, I could improve on that sweater unwinder. While it worked, it definitely had a lot of room for improvement. And I will say, as you can see, I did manage to get everything up and running, and I feel like I'm in the middle of magic. It feels like it's magical that I have these machines that are working in the background for me. Let's talk about why I decided to create basically an electronic skein winder, also called my sweater unraveler, and the entire process and steps that I went through in order to design it and have it working. So firstly, why would you want to go this route? I first got this idea because I was watching some other YouTube videos, especially because a sweater quantity's worth of wool can be incredibly expensive to buy, versus when I look in my local thrift stores, I can get extra fine merino sweaters. I can even get cashmere sweaters for under $10. It does require work, but it does mean that from the monetary sense, it is a lot less expensive for me to get a thrifted sweater and reuse it. There are a few ways that you can do this. I think the most cost-effective way is to do it by hand. You just roll it into a skein around your arm. I have done that process. It takes a long time, so you're not spending money, but you are spending time, which you can't really ever get back. The other option is that you can actually get a swift, which can be relatively inexpensive, and then you can use that swift to unravel the yarn. You might be thinking, why not use a ball winder? I have done that too, but I do find that wool tends to hold the memory of the stitches. It gets a lot of waves and kinks in it, which makes it harder to reknit. So I prefer to create a skein and then wash and dry it with a little bit of tension so that it can remove that memory of the stitches that it was knit into in the factory. I had been doing it that way for a few months when I decided that I was just very exhausted, and I motorized one of my Swifts, but there were some hiccups with it. It was really unwieldy and large. It took up a lot of space, and so it was easy for me to knock over. There was no adjustment really on the tension of the skein, so it was actually really tough for me to get off the skein winder once it was done. And I also ended up breaking the pegs off of the skein winder because the tension it was under was so high when it was unraveling sweaters. Now, with a 3D printer and with all of those issues previously in mind, I thought that was the perfect opportunity to try to make another electronic skein winder. Let me go over some of the various iterations that I did in order to get to this final version. Well, kind of final. We'll talk about it. Step number one was to figure out how to mount this bearing into my eventual skein winder. I knew I wanted the bearing because I wanted to reduce the friction of the point where the center axle goes through the hole that supports it going from the motor to the skein winder. And so my first task was to figure out what was the best dimensions and size for the 3D printed bit that would hold this bearing. So I printed a few test prints until I finally got the one that would fit perfectly. And then I could design the rest of my yarn winder around that. I initially took a lot of heavy inspiration from the first skein winder that I created, and I thought about putting it standing on a desk and then having the axle of kind of like I think it's called an Amish Swift, same as the one before, right in front of it. This had a few issues. The first is that I was limited by the size that my printer could print. This is the maximum height, which is 10 inches. And when you have a cross in front of it with enough clearance to not hit the bottom here, you are not making a skein that is 1 yard large. It's a pretty small, dense skein, and that could be fine, but I know that with the quantities of yarn that I'm handling, I wanted a bit bigger size. I did this as a rough draft print too, so there's a few like cracks and things, and it's not a very good print. It just was hopefully enough just to test it out. I printed it quick and dirty, basically. And I just didn't like how unstable it was either, and it would require me to use a separate clamp to clamp it on the table. Just seemed unwieldy and like it was going to break like my last one, which is when I kind of had a brainwave when I sat this on my desk. I thought, what if I didn't have as long of a front piece and I just let it hang over the edge so that the cross pieces, the front swift part, could hang over the edge of my desk, and then I could make it as big or as small as I wanted. So I went back to the drawing board, or actually CADing program, to redesign that. And I came up with this version, which is very cute, much smaller, much more compact than this larger version. You'll also notice a difference here in the height, and that's because I mismeasures some things. I do have a set of calipers I've been using to measure everything, but still I managed to get it wrong. So I fixed the height so that the axle was at the right spot on the motor, and I also changed the screw holes a little bit so that I could mount the motor onto the bracket a little bit easier. Again, all draft, so I had some printing errors, but that didn't really matter to me. I was just trying to understand how this could work the best. I would plant this on the edge of my desk. I had a separate clamp that I could clamp on and clamp it to my table, but the problem was that the clamp was really wide. And I could go out and get different size clamps, and I was considering doing that so that, because if the clamp is this far out, I'd have to make the axle really, really long in order for that skein arms to not interfere with the clamp. And that felt like I was going to make the whole piece a lot more unstable, which is when I had my final brainwave of why am I making the clamp separate when I've already made a yarn winder with a clamp as a part of it? Why not 3D print my clamp into my skein winder and have it integrated so that my motor and all the axle could sit right at the edge of the desk. And that is how we finally got the final version so far of the clamp that will hold the motor and axle bearing for my skein winder. The next bit, I guess, was figuring out the cross arms of my skein winder, and that I went back and forth a little bit. So to get exactly 1.5 yards, I did some calculations. I had purchased some pieces of wood that I thought were about the right size-ish. I knew I'd have to cut them down, but I thought they were about correct. And in order to cut it to that dimension, which is like right between 19 and 20 inches, I would have to cut up both pieces of wood. My pieces of wood are 36 inches long, and rather than cut into two, I decided, 18 is close enough. It's not going to be like the full size skein, but it'll be just a little bit under if I cut it directly in half. And that's what I ended up doing. I also wanted to make sure that when I lined up the two plates on top of each other, that I had routed some notches into them. So I used my router. I got a router for the first time and used it to create those notches. Wow, that's very dramatic lighting. You can barely see me. I'm so sorry. I just need to give you a quick update because I have to really run out the door if I'm going to make this on time before things shut down. So I'm trying to put the router together. And the reason I got this particular router is because my parents have a whole bunch of these other sets with the batteries. Turns out these batteries are not compatible with this router. But there's some in stock and they're actually on special clearance right now. So I am going to go run out the door right now and rush to get some batteries for this router. It would be nice if I could do the routing today. I'll see you in a second, hopefully with some batteries. Like 1.5 hours later, and I have the battery that I need. I was going to do this outside, but the sun has now set and it is, it was cold today, but when the sun sets, it's really cold. So I'm wondering where, maybe in my hallway. I think that might be a good place if I can find a table to clamp this to. It was really funny. I was talking to my dad. I'm like, I'm at the hardware store and I'm about to buy a router. Do you have a router? I don't want to buy another one if you already have one. He's like, yeah, where do you need the internet? Oh no, not that kind of router. I know you have plenty of those routers, but I mean like the tool. So that was good. Anyway, we got the battery. Let's clamp this somewhere secure. With the notches created, that was, a bit of back and forth and misunderstandings, but we got there at the end of the day and it was really fun. I loved using the router. The pieces fit together, but it's my first time using a router, so they weren't really all that great, and the wood pieces still had a lot of play between the two of them. And I spoke about this a little bit with my dad. My dad and I love brainstorming. I think he is where I got all of my tinkering from. He tinkers all the time too. So we talked about it a little bit and he recommended like a front plate. In Germany, a lot of the old houses have these like cross plates built into the walls in order to stabilize them from shifting and moving too much to make the buildings unstable. I forget exactly what there's a German name for them, and I wouldn't even know the English translation, and I forgot the German name anyway. So I'm just going to call it my front plate. And he recommended that I design one of those for my particular Swift in order to add that stability that's needed. I decided to round off the edges a little bit so it looks a little bit like a 4-leaf clover-ish, or maybe like a little flower. I don't know. I think it looks very cute. I'm very happy with that design. And I attached that as well as the bars that would hold the yarn as it's being wound onto the skein winder. I wanted to have a little bit of a cup that the yarn would sit in, but I didn't want that cup to be too deep so that when I wound up the yarn, I couldn't get it off the side. And so I came up with the idea of one of the arms being flexible. So I can unscrew the nut a little bit, and there's a channel so that I can move that arm to the side and it'll slide down, allowing just enough room to get the yarn off of the Swift without having to add so much force to it. So I think that worked out really well, although an improvement could be rather than having a typical nut, I can use a wing nut there so I can more easily undo it and re-tighten it just with my fingers, because it is a little, it's a hair tough to do it and to tighten it enough. The other design note about the arms that you might notice is that it has a brace to it. So it has that triangular brace underneath it. I mean, I designed it a little bit to have like a little curve and all of that, but the main bit that I wanted was extra stability so that the arms didn't slowly start bending and cracking inwards, which is what happened on my last skein winder. That is the current iteration of my skein winder. I'm very happy with it. There are a few things I would still improve, like adding a wing nut. The through axle to the skein winder works very well, but it was very hard to drill. So I think what I might do in the future is that front plate, I would actually extrude the depth of the wood through there, and the inner diameter being exactly what I need for my axle. And then I can just drill it a little bit bigger, and it doesn't have to be exactly centered because the axle will rest on that 3D printed part rather than on the wood itself. So I think that would be better for me to do in the future, but it works right now as is, and I'm very pleased with it. So why don't I take this sweater and undo the seams and put our skein winder to the test. Let's begin by removing all of the tags from the inside of the sweater and then undoing the seams. The seam should be sewn with this chain stitch that you can see right here, and you should follow the V's up to the top. So go in the direction of the V's to the top ends of the sleeves and cut through one or two of the loops, undo a few more, and then when you have a loose end, the nice thing about the chain stitch is all you have to do is pull and it will unravel down the entire seam. It should at least pretty easily. These commercially made sweaters are typically put together all in the same order, so if you're undoing one of these, I recommend starting with the arms and then going to the sides, then the shoulders, then the collar. Then I get a little bit of that particular panel unraveled before I set it up on my skein winder. All of these extra bits that you get from the seams I'm saving because I have some ideas in the future as to what exactly I'm going to use that for. Now we can set it up on our sweater unraveler or electronic skein winder, and look how beautifully it works. I also created this little bit of a yarn guide so that it keeps the yarn as centered as possible across the little arms that the skein winder has so that we're not falling off quite as much. And you also saw that sometimes the sweater pulls a little bit, so it protects the skein winder a little bit from some of the shenanigans that can happen when you're trying to unwind your sweater. And all that's left to do at this point is to sit back and enjoy watching this machine unravel some beautiful wool for you to reknit in the future. I am so pleased. My new sweater unraveler has worked so well. I have these 4 lovely skeins of superfine merino wool that I can reknit or remake into something completely different. I know last time I had some people ask me for the files to 3D print the yarn ball adapting thing to make it motorized. I know you'll probably be interested in having that as well for this sweater unwinder, but they are still kind of a little bit in a rough state. They need at least one more iteration and a little bit of a cleanup before I'm comfortable releasing them. But if that's the case, I will let you all know, for those of you who have a 3D printer, so you can print it for yourself. And I mean, who knows? It's not totally out of the question that I might make the 3D printed parts and all the hardware available for whoever wants to build one themselves or convert their Knit Picks yarn winder into an electronic one. Let me know if you're interested. I might work on that. I have so many things I am thinking about and wanting to work on, and why not just add to it? I hope that you enjoyed today's video about designing an electronic skein winder so that I can unravel more of my thrifted sweaters without taxing my body too much. And maybe it inspired you to think of a way that you could get luxury yarn on a budget as well. I know that we all have so much going on, so I really appreciate that you decide to spend a little bit of your time with me. I hope you enjoyed, and I will hopefully see you again really soon. Bye!